Hello, my name is Laura Burkhardt, and welcome to Yoga Business Secrets. I am here with Jason Crandell, and we are going to be talking about being a traveling yoga teacher. So
Yep.
welcome, Jason. Not only Jason is
Hi, Laura.
hi. Not only is Jason my main mentor and teacher, but he's just a teacher who teaches all around the world, and he's going to tell us more about that. So Jason,
Sure.
would you introduce yourself, especially for those who may not know you, whoever is out there who does not know you, about yourself and where you teach outside of San Francisco?
Sure. So I'm Jason Crandell. I've been teaching yoga for just about 20 years. I've been based in San Francisco that entire duration. And for about 13 to 15 years or so, I've been traveling pretty heavily in teaching. I both have a Vinyasa background, but I've also studied with a lot of top-level Iyengar teachers for long periods of time. And Rodney Yee is my primary teacher, and Richard Rosen as well. So I always tell people I'm on the bookish side of the Vinyasa yoga spectrum.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And so how did you start teaching outside of San Francisco? How did that even begin to happen?
Really for me, it came by through a fortunate set of circumstances. And to be honest, just a little bit the luck of time and place. I was in Rodney Yee's teacher training program. This was in 2000. I had already been teaching yoga for a little while, but I was in his training program. And he was then and still is one of the top teachers in the world. And especially at that time, he was extremely busy on the road. He travels a little bit less now, but he was just grinding really hard on the road. And I started to travel just a little bit with him as an assistant.
Mm-hmm.
So as an assistant, I did a couple retreats with him, and I also assisted him on several conferences or at several conferences. And as I assisted him at several conferences, that was the first thing that opened up certain networks. So I remember being in New York. I remember assisting him. It wasn't the Yoga Journal conference. It was the Omega conference in New York in probably 2000 or 2001. And as I was assisting him, there were 3 different people that came up to me after the class and said, "Hey, we have studios in X, Y, and Z. Would you be interested in coming to teach?" So that's really how it happened. It was totally organic, and it was through working with my teacher and just beginning to replicate some of that process that he had established. It wasn't something that I had set out to do. Now, I also wasn't opposed to it. It was certainly something that I admired from the outside. I admired the idea of traveling, and it seemed really, it seemed just exciting, and it was, and it still is to some degree, but it just seemed like this exciting world that I was interested in being a part of. But it wasn't like I set out with some strategic business plan to locate at X, Y, and Z. And that's how it happened.
Mm-hmm.
And that organic build just continued.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so back then, it seems like mostly people, they contacted you or they
Yes.
asked you to teach for them. Is that still the case, or over time, or around that time, did you actually start reaching out to studios or conferences to teach for them?
Yeah. So I can think of one situation and one situation only where I have ever contacted someone and said, "Hey, I would like to teach here." I don't think it's a problem to do that. And I actually advise a lot of the people that I train and mentor when I think that they're ready.
Mm-hmm.
I tell them, "Hey, I think you should contact this person or that person." But I haven't done it that way. And part of the reason that I haven't done it that way is it organically built. And again, I had a lot of exposure pretty early in my career, both from assisting, like I spoke about with Rodney, but I also had a lot of exposure through my relationship to Yoga Journal at the time.
Mm-hmm.
I was Yoga Journal's in-house yoga teacher. I started that, I think, in 2001. And so I was teaching the Yoga Journal staff. They were my corporate client, right? And so I started writing for them. I started becoming involved with their online content. I created their first round of yoga podcasts, both audio and then video. You were part of the video. You were part of that whole thing, actually, right? You were actually really instrumental in that process. So I had a national teaching platform that was starting to develop through my relationship to Yoga Journal. So Yoga Journal was extremely indirectly helpful for me in that. And when I say indirectly, I mean they didn't make the arrangements for me, but the media that I got from creating content for them provided me with an audience.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then
so I've been fortunate. I've been really, really, really fortunate.
I feel like for most, because the yoga teaching roster, a lot of people, there are so many people who are teaching yoga these days. So
Yeah, of course.
Like you came in at a time where it might have been a little bit easier to do that and kind of get essentially. And then there's the rest of it. And then there's the other of us.
It wasn't the case. We go back and forth about this for a while, Laura. It wasn't easier. It was harder. It wasn't either. It wasn't easier. It wasn't harder. It was different. And so what I mean by that is right now, what you have is you have countless avenues towards self-publishing, right? Mm-hmm. This is self-publishing, right? We didn't have this 15 years ago, right? We didn't, I mean, it's like, I feel like such a dated old man saying this. I mean, we did have the internet 15 years ago, but not really. We didn't have the social platforms. Mm-hmm. We didn't have the LMS. We didn't have YouTube as this sort of infinitely big net, and everything had to be routed through essentially one or two sources. You either had to be routed through Yoga Journal, or you had to be routed through Gayam, or right. And so the talent that they would take on was really small. So when Yoga Journal expanded to include me in their conferences, for a whole year, I was the only new teacher that was brought up. So the upside was that the market wasn't as cluttered. There weren't as many teachers, but you had no self-publishing pathways to sort of expedite your growth. And now people have those expedited pathways. So it wasn't easier, but there were easier things about it, and there were harder things about it.
I see.
You know, I'm opinionated. I had to go there.
No, I see what you're saying, especially all the different platforms, social media, YouTube, as you were saying.
Yes.
So I'm gonna jump down to some questions. And
wait, one more.
Go ahead.
Which is, do you know how we advertised? We would ourselves create in Word a flyer and post it at random places. I would literally go to places in San Francisco when I was teaching a workshop. I'd go to like People's Cafe and like all these random places with a piece of paper and be like, can I put this in the window? You know what I mean? Like
rainbow.
We didn't have email lists. We didn't have these networks. And so it was a really different thing. So yeah.
Okay. So for people nowadays, teachers who weren't teaching 20 years ago, what would you recommend for someone who actually nowadays who wants to be a traveling teacher? What are like the first steps? What would you say? And how long do you think they should have been teaching by now? Like if they're like, I want to start teaching at different studios, what do you think that how many years should they have been teaching?
I don't want to put a timeline on it. But I think, because I think there's something better than duration, which is point of view and content. You know what I mean? Like the thing is you have to have a point of view as a yoga teacher. You have to have, sort of a clear, definitive voice. And you have to have specific content that you're trying to teach, right? I don't really think anymore that as a potentially traveling teacher, because there's two things we need to separate out, which is being a traveling teacher, and then that's one. But then the second one is being a traveling teacher that people actually come to your classes, and those are totally different things, right? Because it's not that difficult to set up workshops here and there, but it's really difficult to get people to come to your workshops. So a lot of times people start to become a yoga traveling teacher. They contact this place and this place and this place, and they say, hey, I'm going to be in Iowa visiting family. I'd love to teach a workshop at your studio, blah, blah, blah. And that can be really nice, and that's valuable, and I don't want to undermine it, but that doesn't mean anyone's going to come. Because when people are coming to workshops, they're spending more, right? So you have to sort of you have to give the marketplace, the student base, a reason to spend $55 for 2.5 hours of your time, as opposed to spend $18 to take class on that day with the teacher they already know and like.
And how do you do?
So I think that the first thing that we have to really have a sense of is, well, what are you offering? What are you bringing? Like what are the takeaways? What is the value? What is Laura Burkhart going to convey to people in Des Moines that the other people in Des Moines aren't conveying? Which doesn't mean you have to be better. It's not about better or worse. It's about having sort of unique qualities and distinctions, right? So I think that you are ready to get on the road and have people come and come back when you have gained clarity about what your content actually is, and like what you are really good at teaching and what you feel passionate about. Those things have to be there first. There has to be some sort of niche or some sort of specialization, right? And I think we can take my example, which is, because the niche doesn't have to be overly defined, but I think that people that have heard of me but not taken class with me probably already know that I'm a more technical, anatomically driven teacher of Vinyasa yoga. They know that they're going to get a linear process. They know that they're going to have clearly articulated rationale for what the thigh bones do and how the hip joint works in this lotus class, right? So you have to have that. You really have to have a sense of clarity and purpose and skill around teaching specific things. Yeah.
And one of the things we talk about in the course is actually having a vision for sure.
Sure. Yeah, that's basic. But it's so important to remind people that this is the basic thing we have to do. Yeah, for sure.
And then also, one of the things that Cassandra talks about, which I think is great, is serving everyone. When you try serving everyone, you serve no one.
Agreed.
And so,
1,000%.
And then also defining who it is your target audience is, and what your purpose is as a teacher.
Yeah, absolutely.
And bridging that. And so we talk a lot about signature programs and creating those. And I think that's actually what makes you stand out. So just saying like you're a Vinyasa flow teacher, well, so is everyone else.
Exactly.
Yeah. So when creating these like signature programs, do you recommend when, let's say, I think nowadays for a lot of people, they might have to contact a studio. Do you think it's easier for them to offer like a 2-hour workshop, like two 2-hour workshops, or like a full day or a weekend either workshop or continuing education, whatever it might be? Or I've noticed that with you do like a lot of like 4 or 5 day like trainings. And out of those, what tends to be the best selling? People have commitment issues, and then at the same time, on a financial standpoint, overall, what tends to be best? Totally.
Okay. So a lot of questions in there, all are good. So when you spoke about signature content or signature programs, that's me talking about content. So we're totally in agreement on this, right? And also I'd say one more thing, which is your content or your signature programs, they're going to change over time. They're going to evolve over time. The things that you focus on as a yoga teacher and as a yoga practitioner, they're not going to change like the breeze, but they are going to evolve over time. So for me at this phase of my life, the majority of my market are yoga teachers. The majority of the people that I work with are yoga teachers. And that's the case whether I'm teaching a 300-hour training, whether I'm teaching at a conference, whether I'm teaching a 3-day weekend workshop, or whether I'm teaching like a 5-day training immersion. The majority of my students that come to these trainings are teachers. And that makes sense. Number one, there's a ton of yoga teachers. Number two, all of us yoga teachers know that we need increased education. It's actually really important. We're educators, so we have to be educated. So for me, my focal point when I train is I know my audience. They're teachers. I would say a second thing with this is when I'm looking at a weekend, right? Because that's the question you're starting to ask is like, if someone's trying to develop this ability, right, and this demand, well, there's a lot of things that you have to balance, and you have to be reasonable with the amount of demand that you have. And if you don't have demand in a market, you don't want to go into that market and try and sell, you know, a 3-day program that includes 6 to 8 workshops, right? It's too much. And so I think when you're newer to this, and what I advise all the people I train is literally, because I know we're talking about travel, but I would say that the first thing you want to do is travel that does not include an airplane, right? So it's travel, like we live in the Bay Area, right? So, but the point is that people have, like within a 2-hour drive of wherever anyone that is listening to this program is, there are a lot of studios within a 2-hour drive. I guarantee it. So you want to think about like your weekly classes that you do not travel to. And then when you become a traveling teacher, you want to start to think like, what's 30 minutes away? What's 45 minutes away? What's 60 minutes away? You know, for me, it was Pleasanton, right? I would teach in Pleasanton. I would teach in Sacramento. I would teach in Stockton. I would teach in the North Bay. I would teach in Los Gatos. So those were all essentially 3-hour workshops, right? A 2 or a 3-hour workshop, right? Where I would earn, you know, at that time I'd earn like $500, right? Or maybe if it was a really good one, it would be more like $1,000. But there wasn't a big risk because I didn't have to have a hotel. I didn't have to book a flight. The only risk that I had was my time and my pride, right? So that would be the first thing I'd recommend. Short afternoon workshops at studios that you travel locally to. And then from there, you want to start to figure out how to scale up an entire weekend based on demand, right? So as you are doing, right, I'm sure in other things, you guys will talk about social media and marketing. You know what I mean? This is like 101 now for yoga teachers because we have to have an entrepreneurial skill set, not just an educational skill set. So when you're teaching the workshops that you've driven to, take pictures, promote it, publish it, you know, develop a certain demand around your workshops that you drove to so that grows interest for those things that you get on an airplane too. Then when it comes to getting on an airplane, just remember, like all of a sudden you have a lot of cost.
Right.
Because you don't just have the cost of the airplane and the lodging and the meals, but you have the lost revenue of your Friday, Saturday, and Sunday classes, which for most yoga teachers that should be starting to think about this, you should already have good, strong weekend classes, right? If you haven't already sort of built up into your local, if you haven't built demand in your local market, it's not time to start building a demand where you don't live, because that's not scalable. Like it sounds sexy and interesting, but it will not work. It is not a scalable phenomenon. So there's a lot of challenges to that.
Yeah. So, no, it actually relates to when people start even doing retreats. You know, I always recommend start local.
Totally.
And then once you get a good rapport with those people, a lot of times then they actually want to travel with you somewhere else.
Exactly.
So then how about, how do you actually choose which, actually we'll go into.
Let me give you one exception. Sorry to cut you off. Let me give you one exception, which is, let's say you're going on vacation and you want to go there anyways.
Yeah.
You know, like I remember doing this in Hawaii a really, really, really long time ago. I was already going to Hawaii. I was going to Kauai. So I contacted a local studio there because I had a connection. I had a rapport, right? I contacted a local studio and said, hey, you know, we've talked about doing some work together. I'm going to be in Kauai during these days. Do you want to do a workshop? Mm-hmm. Boom, we did it. It went really well. So that's the type of thing, right? Or my family lives in the Toledo area, right? So when I first started traveling, I was still going back to visit my family 2 or 3 times a year. I had a relationship to a studio in Detroit, Karma Yoga, I think it was. Yeah, Karma Yoga in Bloomfield Hills or Bloomington Hills, or whatever it was. And I would just contact them like 6 months out and be like, hey, I'm visiting my family during these dates. Let's do an afternoon workshop. Mm-hmm. Because then my time wasn't a risk. My cost wasn't a risk. I was going to be there anyways. And it became a way, if nothing else, it was a tax write-off, right? It's like I was able to expense certain parts of that trip because I turned them into a work trip. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing to think about as you start to scale up.
Right. And then when you start to teach at other studios, it's a couple things, but one, like, how do you know what your base rate is? Like, mm-hmm. what should you say? Because I feel like you should have a base rate. Mm-hmm. You're going to be, especially going to be traveling pretty far someplace. Yes. And then what would you say for someone who's starting out being a traveling teacher? What would you say is a good revenue percentage breakdown? Like how much you make, how much you make, and also how much you would think that for traveling costs, things like that, how much the studio take care of, lodging, things like that.
Sure. So let me walk you through sort of the financial nuts and bolts without using exact numbers. Mm-hmm. Number one, for me, every time I travel, I go with a minimum guarantee. And I'm able to do that now because I'm not asking studios to teach there. Studios are asking me to teach there. Mm-hmm. And so when I get approached by a studio, I have a sort of a one sheet that my assistant sends them and says, this is the minimum, this is the capacity we're used to, these are the durations, these are the hours that Jason teaches on a weekend. And then that's a starting point, right? There can be some negotiation, but so I always go with a minimum. Now the reality is, if you aren't being asked to teach somewhere, but you are asking them to teach there, you really have no leverage to start off with a minimum. You just don't. And studios, especially nowadays, the profit margins are usually pretty slim. Mm-hmm. And studios, unless you are a fairly known commodity, studios aren't going to want to risk like, okay, I can guarantee you X amount of dollars, blah, 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 no matter what. So more of what you're going to look at is you're going to look at a revenue split. Okay. And the revenue split, I'll go into a little bit of a detail, but usually the revenue split is 60-40 of net. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you can leverage into 70-30% of net. Once in a while, if you don't have a very good deal, it's 50-50, right? And so what that means is ideally you, the teacher, are getting 60-70% of the net revenue that comes in, okay? And what net means is you've taken out the expenses. So let's do really simple math, okay? This would probably not work this way, right? Okay. And I'm going to give you a relatively big number. That's what I mean. Like I'm going to give you a much bigger number than most people are going to have just because it's an easy number to work with. Okay. So let's say you do a weekend workshop and the total amount of revenue that gets taken in for that weekend is $10,000, right? And that, again, that's a bigger number than most people are going to work with, at least for the foreseeable future, but it's an easy number. So let's say $10,000 come in. And let's say your hotel cost $500 for 2 nights. Let's say your flight cost $500 for the flight. And let's say there was a marketing budget of $250, right? I forgot my numbers.
That's all right. 10,000. I 10,
oh yeah, no, I gave you good numbers. The hotel we're saying is, okay, we'll do it.
$500 for a hotel.
No, let's make it easier. Let's make it easier for ourselves. The flight cost $500. The hotel cost $250.
Okay.
The marketing cost $250. That's $1,000 off the top. Okay. So $10,000 came in, but there were $1,000 of cost. So then what that takes us down to is the net revenue is $9,000, right?
Right.
So you get 60 or 70% of that $9,000, and then you are reimbursed for whatever your costs are.
Got it. And
that's how I work it. So right. Yeah, so it's always factored in. I'm always guaranteed a certain amount of revenue, and then beyond, what my minimum is, I am guaranteed 70%. So if it is a low performing weekend, then I get a minimum. If it's a high performing weekend, then I get that split because it is above the minimum. Right. I do all of my purchasing. So I purchase the flight, I purchase the hotel, and then I'm reimbursed for that. And that money comes out of the earnings. Right. So I'm incentivized to keep my expenses relatively low, right? It's not like I buy a $9,000 ticket and then stay at $1,000 a night hotel, because then there's nothing left over.
Right. And that makes sense. And it seems like with those numbers, as you're saying, the cost that you're actually putting in your credit card or whatever else, if they're asking you to teach,
yes,
that is taken off of the total revenue. Whereas if you are going and you are you're asking them to teach at the studio, that's your personal cost, and also taking consideration your time away, and not making that revenue from your classes.
Totally. Right. And you might decide to yourself, you know what? This relationship is really important. I really want to build it. My family lives in Florida. Mm-hmm. I'm going to visit my family 3 days or 3 times a year. And not only does my family live in Florida, but they're getting a little bit older. So I might actually want to spend 3 months of the year teaching in Florida. Mm-hmm. So then you might decide to make a connection with a local studio in Florida where you don't present them with a bunch of risk, right? You don't say, guess what? It's going to cost you $70,000 to have, that's no one's minimum, by the way, but you know what I mean? Like, you just say, you know what? I'm coming here anyways. Let me take care of my cost. I'm going to take care of my cost. I'm going to guarantee my cost, but I would like a higher split. I would like 70%. And I'll provide the marketing content, blah, 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 blah. And then you develop a student base at that studio, but also locally, right? If things go well and if it's a good relationship. And then over time, you get greater demand. Because inevitably what's going to happen, let's say this, I said Florida, but let's say this is happening in Orlando, okay? Inevitably someone from Charleston they're going to come to class. Mm-hmm. Inevitably someone from Atlanta might come to class. A studio owner from Fort Lauderdale might come to class. And at that point, they might then be the one that's asking you. Mm-hmm. They might be the one that's saying, hey, I love this. My students would love it. Would you come to Fort Lauderdale? And at that point, that's when you'd say, yes, I'd love to come to Fort Lauderdale. We can schedule it out. And my minimum for the weekend is X. Mm-hmm. My split for the weekend is X. And you got to be reasonable, right? You have to price yourself accordingly. I mean, if I went around and said my minimum for the weekend is $20,000, blah, 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 I get laughed out of the room. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Because workshops, they're not going to generate that kind of revenue. So you have to work with numbers that are reasonable.
So let's say if it's someone who's a newer teacher.
Yeah.
And they're the ones who are asking studios, how should they choose? What would you recommend for them choosing what studios to work with? And then when on the flip side where you're at, where people are asking you to teach at their studios, how do you say, I'm going to teach at this studio, but I'm not going to teach at this studio?
Okay. So if you are trying to select a studio, right? So again, let's just keep using the Orlando thing, right? So if you've decided, hey, I want to develop a relationship to teaching in Orlando for any number of reasons, right? Then what you can do is, I would just use sort of basic taste. So I would literally do a Google search, yoga studios in Orlando, Florida. And then look at all the websites. You can get a lot of information from the website. Like, look at their workshops. Do they regularly schedule people? Do they regularly host out-of-towners? Do they have what seems to be a teacher training program? Do the way that they have written their class descriptions, does that resonate with you? Look at the teacher bios. And let's say, you know, if the owner of a studio is like, in the teacher bio, my main teacher is Rodney Yee and Richard Rosen, and blah, 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 then I'm going to be like, oh, boom, I'm going to go here. Mm-hmm. Maybe for you or someone else, it'd be like, you know, so-and-so studio owner received their 500-hour certification from Rod Stryker or from Shiva Ray or whatever it is. If that person or that style resonates and you have a relationship, then you're going to know that there's a decent cultural fit, right? You want to try to establish that cultural fit by looking at those things. Now, if someone asked me, I would say largely it's the same thing, right? For the most part, at this point, like the challenge I have is there aren't many new locations that I go to because I tend to keep going to the same locations. Mm-hmm. But at this point, if someone asks me, first I send them the minimums, which again, they're not unreasonable, but the minimums are going to vet the studio that was kind enough to invite me, but they have a total mat capacity of 18 people, right? Like that's not going to work. There has to be a mat capacity of above 50, right? So there's going to be that, but then I would also just do a little bit of research on them. You know, if I see like next month they're hosting Catherine Budig, I'm going to say, oh, you know, Catherine and I were close. We know each other. Boom. They're set up to do this type of thing. They know what this business is like. Great. If I get an invitation and I look at the site and I don't see a teacher training program, I don't see teacher bios, I don't see teacher bios that I in any way think that would be a cultural fit, mm-hmm. and they don't regularly host people because there's no one on their workshop schedule, then I'm probably going to decline. Now, 15 years ago, I don't know if I would have declined. You know, 15 years ago, I would take what I could get. But at that point, I was at a very different point in my life. So as a teacher, you sort of, if you're watching this conversation, I will say to you, you have challenging decisions to make. You know, it's just, there's no way around it. You have challenging decisions to make. Mm-hmm. And the reality is it's going to be hit and miss. Mm-hmm. You know, just like your Tuesday noon class is like sort of hit and miss. Your weekend workshop in Alexandria, Virginia in February is super hit or miss. It's going to be that way for a while.
Mm-hmm. And what about contracts? So do you have, like at first, did you have a contract? I'm sure now you do have a contract. Oh, you don't?
At first I did not.
At first you have a contract. I'm sure you might have had to sign a contract with them, but
totally.
Now do you have, so at first no contracts, then later on you might have a contract just saying that you're going to make X amount of money. This is the percentage breakdown.
Yeah.
This is what they're going to cover.
Yeah. That's mostly what my contract is like now. So essentially what I did for a very, very long period of time, up until about 3 years ago, was I just trusted email. Like I just trusted our correspondence. You know what I mean? Like, hey, I'd love to do it. Here are the workshop descriptions. And we agreed upon, I get a 70% split and I fly on United and blah, blah, blah. That's it. Right. And then I got to the point where I realized that it was necessary to formalize it in contract. And there are a lot of really simple boilerplate contracts that are out there for this type of thing. Mm-hmm. And mine is like a one pager. It's really simple, but it's legal. It's bound. I have everyone sign it. I sign it. They sign it before I get on an airplane, before I do anything, before I post it. But all of that stuff is tidied up. And what I will say, from a long bit of advice, a long experience, and I know this can be hard for yoga teachers. And also I think in part it's hard for yoga teachers, but this can be hard for the personality type that a lot of yoga teachers are. You have to specify terms up front. And if you are working with a studio that does not feel comfortable being clear, transparent, and upfront about financial terms, Get out of there.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be clear. It has to be upfront. And it's one of these things in yoga that to have clarity is always better than to not have clarity.
Mm-hmm.
Always, 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 always. But mine is simple. Mine specifies my minimum, my percentage, the reimbursement for fees, right? The reimbursement for my costs. And then it also stipulates marketing cost, right? So if the studio plans to spend more than $250 on marketing, I want to see the line items for that. I want to see, how are you spending more than $250? Where is it going to? Because I know a poster doesn't cost $250. So I want to see that means there's Facebook advertising, there's Instagram advertising, there's whatever there is. If it's under $250, fine, it's a wash, it doesn't matter. But I want to see that itemized, this is where we're spending our marketing dollars if it's coming off of my revenues.
And do they mostly do the marketing, or do you also do the marketing, and do you both like come to agreement as to how much money is going to be spent on marketing and where that marketing is going to go?
It depends. It really depends. It totally depends on the location, right? If I'm going to, I can think of an example. If I'm going to Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, I teach there I teach there every year. It's one of my favorite places to teach, right? Bethlehem, Pennsylvania is like a 90-minute drive west of Newark. The majority of the people that come to that are from the local community, right? I mean, there'll be some people that are going to commute from Hudson Valley, from Bucks County, from places around there. But the majority of the people that come in a smaller town are going to be the community of that studio. In which case, the studio is going to probably spend more of the time and more of the money doing the revenue. If I'm teaching in New York, if I'm teaching in Chicago, if I'm teaching in sort of London or the bigger cities with more people, then I want a little bit more control over how that money is spent. Because if you're doing paid social media advertising, I have a bigger social media network than any individual studio does. So my advertising dollars is always going to go further, advertising to my base than YogaWorks Soho. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just play with it a little bit there. And again, it's not one of those things that has to be really that overthought. That shouldn't be an impediment to teaching, but things need to be marketed. Unless let's say it's a situation like this, right? Like Laura, like you said at the beginning, you're a student of mine, right? You're a really successful teacher in your own right, but you're a student of mine. So let's say a teacher graduates from my teacher training program and they have a studio in Orlando, right? I keep going back to Orlando.
I know you're
right. It's because of you. It's because of the Florida connection with you. But then at that point, I'm going to leverage my network. I'm going to say, hey, so-and-so, you have a studio in Orlando. Laura is really good. She's really successful. She's really building her market base, her student base. So I want you to look favorably on hosting her for a weekend, right? That would be something, that's another thing to do, which is if you have studio owners in regions that you have a relationship to, that is also a big advantage to get people to come, because the studio owner can help sell you. Right. That's what I'm trying to get at, is then the marketing isn't just from Facebook and blah, blah, blah. It's from the teachers there. But if the teachers there can represent and be like, you guys, Laura was in my teacher training program. She was an assistant in my teacher training program. She's awesome. She's going to be here in 2 weekends. You should totally come. That's actually the most successful route, when you have people on the ground that can vouch for you and sort of talk you up to the local community. That would be thousands of dollars of advertising.
Okay, is that as if you were living in Florida and you could vouch for me, or is that how, let's say, the
No,
situation is
studio owner.
what's that? Oh, studio.
No, studio owner, right?
Who's
You are the
teaching me?
assistant of my training.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Someone does my training. They love the training. They love you. They go back to Florida to operate their studio. So at that point, even though you've never taught in Orlando and you don't have any market base, that studio owner does. And that studio owner can talk about you and vouch for you and be like, you guys, you need to come. She helped in this training program. She was awesome.
Got it. Now, would that be something, let's say if I was one of your students, and would that be something that the studio owner would do, or would that be something that one of your previous students would ask you to do? Because I always feel like I would never want to like use someone. I don't like that. I'm just big on like, but at the same time, it's also, yeah, it's finding that borderline between, I don't want to over ask someone to do something, or would never want like to abuse the relationship.
I totally agree with you, right? I totally agree with you. And I can only think of like one situation where I directly asked Rodney, hey, I would love a connection here. But for what it's worth, I think that if your teacher wants to help you, your teacher wants to help you, and for me, and this isn't the case with everyone, and this shouldn't just be about us, right? But for people listening that have teachers that have access to some people, to this type of network, I will tell you some teachers are really proprietary and they are not going to help you to save your life when it comes to helping you build your business. For me, there's no reason if you ask me or a teacher asks one of my students, if they ask me, hey, I really want to establish a relationship to teaching in New York. Do you have anyone in New York you can put me in contact with? I wouldn't hesitate to make that connection. Now, I'm not going to bust my back to keep following up on it, but I've done this dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of times. Just made a connection and said, hey, so-and-so graduated from my training. They're looking for a place to teach in New York. I think they're really great. You can check in and sort of take it from here. So that referral network is something that I believe us as teachers who have access to a network should support our students in building a base.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
And then one more question, going back to contracts, you were saying that you can find them easily. Someone can just download one from the internet, or would you recommend them making just like a Word doc, or should it actually be coming from a lawyer?
I don't have one coming in from a lawyer. I do not, and I'm not going to say whether someone needs or doesn't need a lawyer publicly. I'm going to say from my experience, that the first way I did it was I just started writing out the email agreement in a Word doc, just really simple, like one pagers. And then what started to happen is I would also get a contract from the studio, right? And sometimes I would be teaching at a studio and their contract to me, we would agree on terms, but instead of them signing my contract, I would sign their contract because their contract would be more in depth. And then I just started to really just essentially make that my own. I'd be like, oh yeah, I should specify this. I should specify that. But I think if people were searching on boilerplate user agreement, I don't know. I don't want to comment because I don't know. But I think you just want to have something in writing, and the simpler and clearer, the better. Right. Right. That's it.
Okay. And then what would you say are the pros and cons of being a traveling yoga teacher? And also, is it more, I'm sure the answer could be yes, is it more difficult to be a traveling yoga teacher when you have a significant other or when you have a family?
Yeah. Okay. Well, What are the pros and cons? Let me tell you the teaching pro. The teaching pro is, for me, the bigger the piece of content to teach, the happier I am. So I really love teaching workshops. I really like having 2.5 hours to work with someone instead of 90 minutes to work with someone. The majority of the weekend workshops that I do, the majority of the attendees attend all of the workshops, right? And so I like to have 12 to 15 hours to teach people on a weekend. Like as a teacher, I love that, right? Because then I feel like I really have time to get deep and to build content. So I really like that. Another pro for me is that it is much more profitable. Now, it's not much more profitable for others. For a lot of people, it costs them money to do these things. Or it ends up being sort of equal. You make $1,000 on the weekend, but you gave up 4 days of teaching and you were going to make $890 on those days of teaching. So really you made $110 more and you're jet lagged and you had no weekend off. So now you're right back into the grind. So I enjoy the teaching. I enjoy the additional earnings, just the business side of things, the revenue. I enjoy most places. Like I don't like going places, but I like being places, right? So I really do not like anymore the amount of travel. I like being in Charleston. I like being in Maui. I love being in London, but I don't like traveling to them. You know, and I'd say that that's the biggest con, right? The pro is the con, and it's largely going to come down to where people are in their lives. You know, for a long time, like it was really exciting and sort of, it was never glamorous. Like I've never made the kind of executive level earnings that made this glamorous, right? But it was exciting. It's exciting to go to a lot of different places, and it has fulfilled a lot of wanderlust with me. I have seen a ton of the world. I haven't seen Africa and I haven't seen the Middle East, so I can't say that I've seen the world, right? But I've seen Europe. I've seen all over Asia. I've seen all over the United States. Like I feel really, I feel genuinely like really rich from the experiences that I've had and from the people that I've met. You know, and a lot of the people that I've met, they're ongoing students of mine. They train with me online. They come to teacher trainings. They do workshops. So the relationships are really awesome. The con for me is time away, and it's exhausting. It's exhausting. I'm in my early to mid 40s now. So I started doing this when I was in my 20s, and my ability to sort of like really easily recover is not like it once was, you know, and I'm more and more of a creature of my habit. Like I love my home. I love being at home. I love teaching my local students. I love the little life that I have here. And I don't like airplanes. I don't, you know, and I'm fortunate to stay at much nicer hotels than I used to. So I can sort of enjoy that a little bit, but, it's lonely, you guys. It's lonely. It's like the amount of time you will spend alone on a Sunday night in like a weird airport hotel, questioning your existence. Like there's going to be a lot of those nights.
Yeah.
You know, it's not what it looks like in social media. There's a big difference between the reality and the fantasy of doing this. So is it my preferred way? Yeah, totally, you know, but I have to be clear, like I'm successful at it now. And so it being a successful commercial enterprise takes off a lot of the sting of the jet lag. But if I was now 15 years or so into this, still, you know, getting like 8 people on a weekend and making $700, dude, I would be done. I would so be back in school or any number of things, you know, there's no way. In terms of having a family, I don't actually know in terms of having a significant other. What I will tell you, which is honestly, I think it comes down a little bit to an emotional profile, which is for me, everything is easier with emotional stability and partnership. So even though I miss my wife and I miss my daughter when I'm gone, I still feel in general like more connected and more stable and more grounded because of them.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if I were single, I think it might seem like it's easier and I wouldn't have people to miss on the weekends, but I think that I would be less anchored,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And so I don't know. I think it could go either way. I will say, if you are in a relationship, you and your partner, your family, whatever it is, they have to know the idiosyncrasies of this. And the reality is, my wife is she's a single mother 3 days of the week, many weeks of the year. And that's hard. You know, that's hard. Now, again, it's worth it because we have a level of commercial success that this is what pays for our bills. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge for sure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree with you. I think sometimes for yoga teachers, because no matter if you're teaching a ton of public classes or if you're running around, I think sometimes relationships, they can be tricky. At the same time, I do feel that it's nice having that like emotional support.
Totally. Yeah. I truly do not think, I know that I couldn't be doing what I've been doing for the last 10 years if it weren't for my wife. I 1,000% know it. Like, I just know the stability and the focus, and also the actual support, the actual work support, because of the nature of my wife being Andrea, who does a bunch of content and she knows this world. But just in terms of emotionally, I would be a basket case if I flew 100,000 miles a year every year for the last decade plus, and if I didn't have a real solid emotional life to help stabilize that, it'd be really hard.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
So are there any other last minute comments, concerns, tips?
No, I think the only thing is that I want to go back to this point of thinking about scale and being realistic about this process. So we want to make sure that, one, that we're not over romanticizing and that we're not over glamorizing what being on the road is. Because what I'll say about being on the road, being a traveling teacher, is literally talk to anyone whose work puts them on an airplane every week and talk to them about their life. Mm-hmm. Because that's what it's going to be. It's business travel, right? It isn't like when I go away for the weekend, I'm not sipping Mai Tais and working on my tan and pressing the handstand and then, staying at the 5-star retreat and then flying back while sleeping. You know what I mean? Like that's not what this actually is. This is like someone who lives in San Francisco and works in Atlanta. That's sort of actually what this is like. So it's valuable to talk to someone that has done that for a long time. And just to see whether or not that is something reasonable for your nervous system. And if it is, go for it. Then secondly, when you go for it, which is, I think you call them signature program, I just call it content or point of view. But just remember that you have to make it very clear to your audience why the value in them spending $50 for a 3-hour workshop as opposed to going to their favorite teacher on that day. And that's a hard sell, you guys. It's a really hard sell. So we can't get sort of overly excited about the what we think is the glamour of travel without doing all of the work first. You have to know who you are. You have to know what you're teaching. You have to be patient. And don't skip the step of doing weekend afternoon workshops that you can drive to. Mm-hmm. Don't skip that step, because that's also going to be a place where you're going to get better at it. You don't want your first workshops away from your home base to be, a 4-hour flight away And there's all of a sudden you have to teach Friday night, all day Saturday, and all day Sunday without actually having a lot of time knowing what that is like. So don't rush it. I say this all the time. This is sort of, I say this all the time in my flow classes. No urgency.
Mm-hmm.
No urgency. Don't rush. Patience. Don't rush. Be systematic. You got a lifetime, right? You have to build this. If you think that you might burn yourself out teaching local classes because you don't know how to scale that, you will decimate yourself once you start trying to get on airplanes and market to 30 or 40 different regions a year instead of one studio. It just takes patience. It takes methodology. It takes non-urgency. It takes focus and a plan, and it takes grit. And if you have all those things and you have the passion for it, it's awesome. Mm-hmm. Totally. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yes. Well, great. Well, thank you so much, Jason.
You're welcome.
We appreciate
Thanks,
all
Laura.
your tidbits.
You got it.
And it's been very, very helpful. And
Good.
if you all want to learn more about Jason, go to jasonyoga.com.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.